afternoon and welcome to Brave Embrace. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We have a very special show. Last week, we were talking about the difficulties that arise in the criminal justice system with the process of investigation, whether there's enough evidence to file charges, the issue of DNA, and cold cases. So today, I'm bringing you an expert. We have a wonderful law enforcement veteran, 27 years in the service in the metropolitan area, to bring his take and his expertise to us. Please join me in welcoming Mark Kurkowski. Hey, Mark.
Hello. Thank you for having me on your show.
I'm so glad you're with us. I had the pleasure of knowing you for years and training alongside you. And it's always been amazing the amount of technical information you've provided me and helped me understand as the advocate role in helping clients. You serve on many boards, you've trained nationally, and you're also an expert with the Spark Center. Can you explain that for me a little bit?
Sure. Spark is the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. It's a program of Equitas, which is a national prosecutor resource center across the country. And Spark basically provides training and technical assistance to anybody, law enforcement advocates that are in need of assistance, especially when technology is involved. It's very common. That's definitely something that they do.
I see, and as I read about cases and work alongside victims, it seems like so many times now there is the issue of technology involved, whether through social media, right? Or all the other avenues. We're also connected through our phones and computers. So I'm really anxious to hear your information and tips on that during, living our lives and during an investigation. So I'm going to dig right in if you don't mind. I know you're so compassionate towards survivors of crime, and I've always been moved by that. Not only as a survivor myself, but also just as a woman to know that there, is so much support from you in this field. So, tell me about maybe a case that really stood out to you, someone that you bonded with, or that was a particularly arduous journey through the system.
I think one case that stands out, and like you said, I have handled many cases over the years. I was in our domestic violence unit since 1997 when I first started to work, and handled many cases over the years. But one case that does definitely stick out, it was an incident where the offender kidnapped the survivor from one location to another, where she was raped and physically beaten numerous times and strangled during the incident. And then after the incident, the offender tried to get back with the victim, which is very common in some of these cases. And what happened in that situation, he started sending flowers and gifts and candy to the victim. And right when she said that, I started making that connection as stalking behavior. And as a result of the investigation, we not only were able to charge the individual with kidnapping, forcible rape, multiple counts of domestic assault degree, we also charged aggravated stalking. And as a result of that investigation, the prosecutor's office had a better idea to be able to get all of the incidents that occurred at even different locations and different times all into one case. And we added that charge of aggravated stalking. And we were able to see that those crimes co-occur. And that's very common in some of these cases, that the crimes can co-occur. So it's important to know if there are other crimes that are occurring in that situation, we want to make sure that we charge it. And in that case, we ended up having forcible rape, kidnapping, 6 or 7 counts of domestic assault, and aggravated stalking. And as a result of that, it was a successful prosecution, and the offender was sentenced to 87 years in prison.
My goodness. Thank you for your work there, Mark, and supporting that case and that family. I am amazed hearing the multiple points of entry in your investigative process as a detective to figure out how to elevate really the charges. And you talked about those crimes coexisting. Do you find that's typical now that you have, this understanding of the way these play out?
Absolutely, especially in intimate partner violence cases, we see that those crimes co-occur. And for law enforcement, and I'll be honest with you, in the beginning of my career, I did that. We focus on what crime is occurring at that specific time. If you, for example, I had a case where it was for a simple assault. And when I say simple assault, a misdemeanor assault type incident. And it turned out to be a bigger investigation after we talked to the victim, who had reported that this individual on 6 different occasions at 6 different locations threatened her with a handgun while either stopped at a stoplight or a stop sign. So right away, again, you started off with a misdemeanor assault case, but now you have 6 different felony charges of unlawful use of a weapon. And again, because we saw the connecting incidents, we were able to charge again stalking, because it again gave the opportunity for prosecutors, number one, to charge everything in that case. And that's what happened in that situation too. So it's definitely something, when we can see these crimes that are co-occurring, to make sure we charge everything that we can. And sometimes if we can get that stalking charge included in that, it can help prosecutors and advocates and judges and ultimately jurors to see what is the bigger picture of what is occurring in that situation.
I see. And I think this is absolutely exceptional in the area of what we've been talking about this month, cold cases and things that where not enough evidence is available maybe on one of those types of crimes. But when you figure in those other elements, it sounds like, did that help your case closure rates, did you find, or?
Well, it really depends. So, for example, if you have a domestic assault and it was reported at the time, you have a separate incident at that time. And sometimes officers will respond to the scene, take pictures, take photographs, whatever we can do, obtain victim statements at the scene, whatever we can do to try to build that investigation at that time. But then if other incidents start occurring, especially if the offender now is trying to reach out to the victim on social media, for example, and she blocks them, then the phone rings 40, 50, 60 times a day, text messages, all of that behavior we can start seeing as something that we can obtain evidence through. So we would get phone records, we would go after social media requests to see if that was the offender on the other side. And unfortunately, what happens when that technology is being used, it takes some time sometimes to identify the person behind that technology. So it does become problematic, but I think it's really important to know that we have to work with survivors to make sure that, number one, we know that the victim feels that we care as law enforcement. And then number two, and I've always been, as you know, a strong supporter of advocacy, and you have to make that direct contact to that victim advocate. Because unfortunately, as law enforcement, we're so busy, we're not going to be able to field those phone calls like our advocates did over so many years. And when I say a phone call, it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of phone calls. And many times it's the same victim, because so many things are keep on occurring. And with that, I just want to make one thing. And for me, it was kind of difficult from time to time early on, because I didn't understand the concept of confidentiality with victim advocates. And I think that's a huge part of that, because it makes that victim feel really appreciated, that she can know that she can talk to the advocate without having to come to law enforcement. And I think that's a critical point of that community coordinated response.
Wow, I really respect that. And I think that is a pinnacle of the career that I've witnessed that you have, is that you've been willing to have that multidisciplinary team, discipline where you work together so that everyone can work within their role, but yet there's support ultimately for the victim, which the focus of this show, as we've talked about before, is really inspiring brave, recognizing brave and survivors and their family and in stakeholders in the system, and on honoring it. And what I'm taking away from what you shared is that you are willing to look at all of the elements and go really deep so you can find what you need to build that case. But yet I hear also that it takes time, and so that relationship and that open line of communication is important, so the victim still feels inspired. Is that what you're saying? And feels like they can step into their brave.
Absolutely. And you said a word that really struck me there is elements. And for law enforcement, we have to look at first probable cause. Do we believe that crime occurred? And then after that, we have to look at the prosecutor's office. And that prosecutor or attorney's office is going to have to look at proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And sometimes when we make that connection, there could be that lull, especially if investigating technology cases, we don't have that proof yet to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. So we might have the lull in the criminal justice system. And unfortunately, it happens frequently where that may occur. So it's really important that we stay in contact with that victim. If new things are occurring, we ask a lot for victims, unfortunately, because they make and create their own case sometimes as the evidence comes in. And it's a really important factor for law enforcement to understand. We want that information because as we're waiting for example, a court order or a subpoena or anything else through a social media entity, for example, there's going to be other things that are most likely still going to occur. And we still want to obtain and most importantly, document that information. It's really important.
I see. Do you mind if we step into that investigative role with you for a moment, and maybe you can share, say, for example, in the case that you described, which I'm so thankful that she survived. What a horrific incident. I just get overwhelmed, but I know that you were there encouraging and supporting her and helping build that case then around that arrest and the charging. But when someone is being threatened, say via text or via social media, and there's other things that are co-occurring as you've described, some of the stalking behaviors, the patterns. So how do we share that with you, and what's your investigation process like?
Well, I think any investigation is going to start off with that first response. And I think it's so important because that first response is going to be critical to make sure that law enforcement has that good response, because that victim is going to determine possibly if she's going to call 911 again after that response. So if she has a good response from law enforcement, that's going to go a long way because she knows, hey, I can reach out to law enforcement. They're helpful. They're looking in to see what they can do. They're doing a great job. But unfortunately, sometimes there might be a bad response. And if there is a bad response, more than likely that victim's not going to reach out for assistance. And that's where we have problematic issues or, incidents where things could even go even more awry that could lead to homicide or other things. So it's really important to know that initial response is really good.
Wow, I appreciate that so much, and I think giving the victim that voice to be heard. I wonder if when we've had those maybe non-perfect responses, and like you said, in the beginning of our career in any field, we're never quite our best yet, and so learning the skills, and there's so much more training available, which I can't wait to talk about. You are a big part of that. You train these officers on these responses and how to have compassionate, trauma-informed care and response, because like you said, it helps them with their ability to trust in general in the future. And we've seen in the headlines the underreporting of particularly sexual assault, and I would say stalking and domestic violence, which has been your expertise. And I think that you're working to eliminate that by focusing on building that strong first response. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. And then also identifying those behaviors as that investigation continues or during your interviews, that you can start identifying, for example, stalking behavior or things like that. So I think that's really important.
So say I did have text or messages from someone that I felt were threatening. I just turn my phone over to you, or do you gather the records? You talked about subpoenas and going to the court for that. So tell me a little bit about that.
So if you're going, for example, on cell phones, and it depends on the investigation, If you only have 3 or 4 text messages, yes, I call it the old school of actually, photographing the actual text messages or taking a picture of it, document it that way. But many times we're going to have 40, 50, 100, 200, 500 even text messages. Then we got to start using other technologies that are out there. There's apps called Stitch It, for example, that can enable you a continuous stroll of those text messages. So that's one avenue you can look at. But a lot of times too, when we look at those cell phones, and again, it depends if you're using Android or if you're using an iPhone. If you're using an iPhone, for example, you want to make sure that you get the information where the phone, if it has the offender's name on it, for example, that's good evidence because right away we know, yeah, it came from his cell phone. He didn't change, he didn't alter that information. He didn't use spoofing mechanisms, for example, for that information to come in. So that's a tool that we can use and we know right away. We can get the records from the victim. And a lot of times we can get that just through her consent for looking into her phone. But anytime you go after an offender phone, you're going to need a search warrant most of the time to do that.
Okay. So these messages can be coming in via all of the outlets of social media and email and the texting. So, and I heard you bring up the word spoofing. Can you tell us a little bit about what that's like and what other technologies maybe offenders use to entangle victims?
Yep. So spoofing is where the offender has the ability to change or alter the phone number coming into the target phone or the survivor's phone. So for example, we've had cases where the offender would call, let's say, Spoof Card, for example. They call Spoof Card, it's a specific company that allows you to spoof that number. They call that number, they put in what number they want to show up on the target phone. Usually it's going to be the survivor's phone. And for example, I had a case where the offender put in mom's cell phone and the victim survivor was doing a great job of having zero communication with that offender. When the phone answered, or when she saw the phone caller ID, it showed up as her mom's cell phone.
Oh,
so when she answered it, it was him, and she completely freaked out, and rightfully so. Right away, she called me. She goes, "How did he do this?" And I had to explain the technology. And it can be very frustrating for survivors. That's for sure. But that's one thing. And then also to confuse people, sometimes they'll be able to change the background noise, acting like they're either, for example, in a nightclub, or if they're in a restaurant, you'll have silverware and dishes clinging in the background to make it sound like they're in a restaurant when literally the offender's on his couch again, doing all the technologies that he's doing all from his couch in his home.
Oh my goodness.
So yeah, and we do see those cases. And the thing is now it's very easy to use. And actually it's not just Spoof Card. There's apps, and literally if you go to your phone store on your either your iPhone or Android, you can see all the free apps that are out there. Usually they'll only give you 1 or 2 free and then they'll start charging you. However, it is something that's very accessible and these offenders definitely know.
Wow, I can hear your passion for taking these types of technologies out as a way to victimize people. What is the technology that I've heard loaded into like computers, or say someone's tracking your keystrokes or your computer through mapping or something on your car? Are those some things also that you've had experience with?
Absolutely. So again, those are all technologies that are available to these offenders. And we often get that question, well, how is that legal? For example, a GPS device. It's when we look at these type of technologies that are out there, it's not the technology's fault itself. It's the abuser that is misusing the technology. So for example, if you have a child that are in common with an ex-partner, ex-spouse, they split, they separate, the father gives the child a GPS watch. for example. It's a normal watch that you cannot tell there's a GPS device in there. And literally it could be Superman, Spider-Man, whatever. The child thinks, oh, that's really cool. He starts wearing the watch. Well, the thing about that is that watch contains a GPS device. And now dad knows everywhere where the child is. And completely legitimate way, especially if the child gets lost, whatever. Again, a legitimate purpose for the technology. But again, the abuser might be doing that to keep track of where mom is too, because he knows where that child is. Mom will be most likely with the child as well.
I
So
see.
that GPS is definitely a technology that's out there. And then we have the GPS devices that can go on vehicles. One of my first cases that I've experienced, the offender not only put one device, but he put two devices on the car. And at the time, it was such a new technology, it was very expensive. Each device was $375, and it did not count or, account for the added fee of tracking that device 24/7. So we spent a lot of money on it. But unfortunately, nowadays, these tracking devices are not really that expensive, and they're very tiny. So the technology keeps changing all the time. It's definitely something that we see.
Wow. So that's, I'm assuming one of the areas of your expertise that you train on and facilitate workshops and things for. I think I've known you to do some at community level, right? Community wide to kind of instruct and inform, and then also very technically to law enforcement and stakeholders in the system, which is exciting. And you have a consulting and training company. So you can do things through Zoom, or you can go in person now that things are opening back up, and share this information.
Absolutely. Yes.
I really see that as such a key role in our system to help find justice. But I know that justice doesn't always mean that the case is solved. And so, you have shared with me some of the timeframes and relationships that you've built with survivor families while that investigation is going on, and while you're looking at all the levels of that criminal activity. So how do you, inspire those victims to hang on and hang with you in the system?
And that's a really good question, because again, it depends on the circumstance. But one case that really comes to mind is that I was working with a survivor, and she again was doing everything she could to see what was occurring in this situation. Just a horrendous situation that she experienced. The offender was coming into her residence while she was at work, urinated and ejaculated on her bed, tore up clothes. All of this was occurring, but it was happening every single day over like 30 days. And until the more evidence was coming about to figure out, okay, it's definitely got to be him, she finally reached out to me, and she was actually taking that initiative because she was working with a victim advocate who listened to some of the trainings that I have done, and they actually put a hidden camera inside the residence. And when that survivor came home that day, the camera was completely demolished, and the SD card was taken out. So that means most likely he had some type of surveillance device inside the house as well.
Okay, I was trying to instantly make that connection. I thought, well, did someone give him a tip that
Right.
But
We never found it. We never could prove that, but that was my theory behind that. Because how would he know?
right.
Exactly, go in there, find it, smash it. And she didn't only have one device, she put two devices to do counter stalking measures, which we definitely want to try to do if that technology is being used and we're trying to find more information and evidence to better the case.
Okay.
And in that situation, we only had, after we ended up talking to actually a neighbor who actually cracked the case basically, because he was the one that said, hey, he comes in there every day she leaves for work. I thought they were still together. He didn't even know that they were broken up because he comes into the house every day. And in that case, the victim was so afraid, she left our jurisdiction and moved to another jurisdiction. And soon after moving, he again found her and started stalking her in that jurisdiction. So then we see these types of crimes also cross jurisdictional boundaries. And I think that's something that we have to be concerned about because we see those cases. And it's important to work with those other law enforcement agencies where those crimes are occurring. And just keep in mind too, if it crosses state lines, it could be a federal offense as well, especially in stalking situations.
So this helps inform sometimes the reasons behind the length of the time involved in investigations and why cases maybe seem to go cold because there's so many different elements. How do you go about sharing and sharing the information basically of the crimes that occurred in your jurisdiction? And then do you work alongside those detectives and give them kind of that course of conduct? I think you've called it before, or just those patterns basically.
Right, and you mentioned course of conduct, and especially for stalking cases, we have to piece those puzzle pieces together sometimes. And again, when it crosses jurisdictional boundaries, it's important to work with that agency to let them know this is what's occurring in our jurisdiction, and then see what's occurring in their jurisdiction as well. Because you might have two separate crimes at that point, but you also want to make sure that you're looking at connecting the dots and making sure that you're recognizing that stalking pattern and see what prosecutors can do to look at that charge of stalking in addition to what other crimes are co-occurring.
Okay, so through your time, you've really helped identify the fact that the stalking crime coexists in a lot of those other crimes against persons, and particularly sex crimes or intimate partner violence. And it's interesting because do you find that sometimes victims don't maybe identify or don't feel like they've been stalked? They feel like there's just a relationship there, and so have you had to help them pivot and see it as as a criminal activity or criminal behavior, that kind of thing?
Absolutely. And I think minimization is one of the big things that we see. And unfortunately, that's some of the reasons for not reporting because they don't think it's a serious enough crime until those specific direct threats come. And that's not always the case. In stalking, you can look at other behaviors that are occurring to see if that can be charged even before that direct threat comes into play. It just depends on that situation.
I see. You have helped me learn more about the threat assessment process and how imperative it is to utilize a tool throughout the investigation process of these types of crimes that helps you as an investigator and as a law enforcement professional understand the possibilities and the seriousness of what might occur in the future. Do you mind talking about that tool a little bit?
Sure. And I think that's a huge aspect, whether you're working domestic violence, stalking, whatever the case might be, we want to make sure that we're assessing that risk and those threats that survivor is receiving. And in my opinion, it doesn't matter what tool you are using because different agencies across the country use different tools. As long as we're using that tool to assess the risk and the threat that survivor is posed to, we want to make sure that we counteract that. And again, the best way to do that is reaching out to that victim advocate, getting a safety plan enacted to make sure that we're doing everything to keep that victim or survivor safe in that situation. And the SHARP tool for stalking is a really useful tool because it gives you two things, and basically a storyline of what is occurring in this situation, and then it gives you a safety plan. So SHARP actually gives you two tools in one, and it's a really useful to look at stalking specific threats in that situation. But you also want to look at if it's co-occurring with domestic violence, there's other assessment tools, the lethality assessment plan, and the list can go on, danger assessment, and all the other ones that are out there. As long as you're using something to assess that risk, then we're helping that victim out because that's how we are keeping it safe, by giving that victim a safety.
I really respect, Mark, that with each of these areas we've talked about, it's so important that you bring in the victim advocate. And I hear that is something that is crucial to you in being able to provide good victim services and good investigative techniques by being able to make sure not only they're supported and have access to the resources that we all need, but that there's no gaps within the system or the process, or like you said, when they're calling for information, if you're not available, then they have someone to call. So I just want to thank you for that. I think for years we've worked towards building that relationship between the advocacy world model and law enforcement. And I just know that your appreciation of that service has really helped your victims move forward and finding their brave, seeking justice, even if the cases maybe aren't solved. Do you have any cases that, we've talked about cold cases, or even the rape kit crisis that we've seen over the last few years, where there was, thousands of kits that never were tested, or that weren't held properly in the right dynamics with the temperature and so forth, or those that were lost? Any thoughts on that and how to support victims through that?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is keep documenting everything that is occurring. Because like I said earlier, many times that behavior is going to continue during that process, especially if we're waiting for a subpoena or search warrant for Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever the case might be. More often than not, some other type of behavior is going to occur. And when that occurs, we want to make sure that we keep documenting that process and all of those separate incidents over that period of time, because we're looking for that course of conduct to possibly look at, for example, a stalking charge. Or if there's a new incident of domestic assault, strangulation, sexual assault, whatever the case might be, we want to make sure that we are looking at every single incident that is occurring, every phone call, every email, social media post, whatever it might be. And that documentation process can assist law enforcement and prosecutors build that case as a whole.
I see. I also think that it's very valuable, your time that you've invested in serving on task force and in different groups across the country, to really keep your skills sharp, but then to inform and inspire other agencies to work in that same direction. What do you think has been one of your maybe favorite engagements with an organization or with a task force where you felt like things really moved forward and you saw some change happening?
I think from a local perspective, we have a family violence council, and I've been a part of that for many years. They're doing tremendous work in the community, and that's really important. I believe that as a community, that's how you can make changes. And ultimately, it's going to affect our victims. It's keeping our victims safe and holding the offenders accountable for their actions.
Yes.
And I think at a national level, being able to train nationally, bring in my experiences and my training that I've received since 1997, it's inspiring for me, but I think it does also inspire others and other law enforcement. And that's where I really hope to make sure that we can continue that, because I think it's a really important tool to make sure that we can keep our victims safe.
I think so as well, and hold our perpetrators accountable, like you said. So, we've seen this climate change with law enforcement and communities. For years back, but particularly in the last year or two. And what are some ways that you feel, having been on the road and on the front line, and then also working in the detective role and in some of this leadership and in training, ways that people can feel that law enforcement is on their side, that they want to help them, and it's just such a muddied water right now between what I see in the media and in communities.
Right. And that's a good question. And I think, again, going back to that first response, it's going to have such a big effect on that survivor if she's going to, or if he or she is going to call back. So I think that first response is still critical. And if you have that good rapport with that victim, then you're going to know you're going to have a good response. She's going to call again, or, call the victim advocate that you connect that individual with. And that's how you keep that situation from escalating sometimes. And if it does escalate, then she feels, or he feels, comfortable again calling 911 to report the incident.
Wow, that was really well said. I appreciate that. So then on the legal side of things, as an officer, I know there are required continuing education and things. And have those hours changed, or what does that look like when you're providing training for different agencies and departments, either locally or at the state level or nationally? Every state, I'm assuming, has their, their requirements, right?
Yeah, and every state might be different, so I can't say what one state does to another. But domestic violence, stalking, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, all is getting attention, not only locally, but across the country. So I think it's something that has to definitely continue in making sure that we're training our officers and law enforcement, prosecutors, advocates, and most importantly, judges too. Sometimes I haven't mentioned judges yet, and that's a big factor of everything, because if we're missing the pieces of the puzzle initially through law enforcement, or if we're not, and we get it, the prosecutors get it, the victim advocate gets it, the victim understands everything, but the judges don't, then we're back at square one again, and nothing's going to be accomplished because we're not recognizing the situation at hand.
That's a really important point to highlight, is that, while the victim and their family may think it's all on your shoulders as the investigator or a law enforcement response, but there are other stakeholders in the system that also have input on whether that's charged or whether it moves forward in the system. So you've got the prosecution process and then into the courts. And so once you've created your case file, basically, right, and then you hand that over, for those that maybe aren't as familiar with the system, what's that process?
So, and again, it depends on the situation, but usually what happens, if law enforcement's contacted, we do the investigation from the beginning, the victim statements, any evidence, offender statements, and after that, we gather out the evidence in the situation or in the case, and then we present that to the circuit attorney's office or the prosecutor, depending on your jurisdiction. And they have the determining factor if they're going to continue with prosecution, or there may not be enough evidence to continue that prosecution. And sometimes there'll be enough to continue, and you might have cases that don't. And I think it's really important to know, if we don't have enough information, don't stop there, because again, that offender is going to feel like now he's going to get away with everything. So just because the case didn't move forward in one incident doesn't mean that that offenders are going to act out again, and the same thing will happen next time, because you want to make sure that, again, reaching out to that victim advocate, for example, reach out to me if things occur, and again, she doesn't have to report it because she has, or he has, confidentiality, but it's something to know that just because it didn't get prosecuted the first time doesn't mean a new incident can't happen and get prosecuted after that. So, and then after that process, let's say, for example, if the case gets issued, I haven't mentioned probation and parole. They play another important factor of the criminal justice system, especially if that offender is found guilty and gets put on probation, for example, or parole. That has a big factor, because now probation and parole can put additional standards on the offender in that situation. And it's another way to hold that offender accountable, for example.
I see. Okay, very interesting. Thank you for speaking to that a little bit, so that there's a base of understanding. So I imagine when you've been a part of an investigation, and I'm thinking of myself sitting across the table, 20 some years ago, from interviewers, as I was recounting, a story of being a victim and the situation that I experienced. And there was a male and a female detective there. And I think that was, made it comfortable. But as a man, has that ever been difficult for you when there has been a female victim, or well, any really survivor that has to share those intimate type details? And then there's no charges that are filed. I can't imagine what the burden of that is on you, and how do you deal with that?
As far as I can recall, I never found it as an issue with me. But I'm not saying that it was, and I just didn't recognize it. That's a possibility, obviously. But I think that building of the rapport with that survivor is important. And, it just depends on the situation. I never found it as an issue, but it may have been, and I didn't catch it. And we always have to remember, if the survivor feels more comfortable with a female, then we can definitely bring a female interviewer or detective in for that as well.
Mhm. So are these some of the things that talk about in your trainings? I know you have several tracks of expertise. And do you want to talk about that just a little bit? What are some of the favorite things that you love the information to share?
Well, I think one of the major topics that I'm very familiar in training with, and I find it very interesting, and unfortunately, sometimes law enforcement doesn't look at it as, I gotta be careful how I say that, I guess, but when we look at technology and stalking cases, law enforcement kind of fringes on that a lot of times, because why? It's time consuming, and it's frustrating sometimes because that technology is not going to give you that information right away. Like I say, if we're doing a Facebook subpoena or search warrant, we're not going to get that back in a couple hours. It might be days. They have come a long way when we look at Facebook and Instagram, because they have an online portal now for law enforcement, which is very good because we send all of our legal requests through that. But again, it just depends on that situation. So, I mean, I think that's.
Do you think, it made me think of a point, do you think the crime shows and things that are so prevalent now have helped or have hurt like people's understanding of the real world investigation process in the criminal justice system? Like, you can't just go get DNA response back just like that, right? We don't all have those labs in our towns. And
Exactly. And I think that's a really important factor to know, especially like you just gave the example for DNA. By the end of this episode, we have that information. That's not going to happen. I can almost assure you, time after time, you're not going to get that information in an hour. And it could take some time depending on how backlogged those jurisdictions are with the DNA rape kits and things like that.
yeah, so kind of helping to set proper expectations when you're working with the survivors, and then also having the victim advocate there who can help them process those things, and understanding that the system works a little differently than maybe they have seen on TV, for sure.
Right. And I mean, I think it's a stigma it's a social normalization as well, especially with stalking, that, we definitely see that in some of the movies or some of the songs and the lyrics that are out there. And, I'm not going to mention specific ones, I guess, but well, I guess I can. The Police, Every Breath You Take, for example, that's a stalker, theme song. When you think about it, every breath you take, I'll be watching, for example.
Yeah, I've never thought of it that way. Right?
And we definitely see that social normalization, not only through some of the music lyrics, but in movies as well.
Right, because it comes across as this passionate, adoration of someone, and you'll go to the ends of the earth to try to, make contact with them and confess your love and profess your love, all those things. But I guess maybe you end up confessing to something in the future, perhaps. But this is, I think of the time that you've invested, and your heart that you've invested. I know you're a father and a husband, and, you've got a family. So has it been difficult through the years to hear some of these really deep, dark stories like the one that you shared with us, these accounts of violence that have happened? And, at the end of the day, what is that like for you?
I think it was kind of a thing. You just kind of put it in your back of your mind. And it's kind of something for law enforcement. I think a lot of us do, and we don't really think about it until something clicks. And when that happens, then all of these incidents and trauma that we see through other individuals takes effect on people, and it does. And I think it's really important to know, whatever, if you're not just law enforcement but advocates, prosecutors, especially if you're looking at these types of cases over a long period of time, it's okay to reach out for help. And it's okay to do that. And I think especially for law enforcement, there's kind of a stigma about that. And I think that's really important to let that everybody know that if you need professional help, it's definitely out there. There's crisis intervention teams that are doing excellent work, not only locally, but across the country. And I think it's really important to reach out to professional help.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I assume that also when you're training in those, modules that you weave that in, because I know your heart for wellness and for safety and for balance. And I've just seen you through the years really support your survivors and encouraging them in big ways and small ways. I know you like quotes and you like funny, jokes and things to bring light to the darkness of that. And for me, Mark, that's why I'm so honored to know you and your work, because that encourages brave in people. That shows them they're not alone. And like you described earlier, if something else happens in that line of the criminal activity or in another situation, they know they can call. You're going to believe them. You're going to believe first and be there to support them.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's been an honor and pleasure working with you over the years as well. So it's been a great time. And,
Yeah.
you're an inspiration for many people. So I was glad to be part of that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And the law enforcement that I dealt with in the different jurisdictions of my victimization really inspired me to carry on and to find hope. I mean, there was, I kind of call it the good, the bad, and the ugly, because there were things that could have been done differently or better. But again, with each year, I think we all learn new techniques and learn new things, and our career expands because we're willing to embrace new things. And I think in this field, it's been that way for sure. And so that compassionate response, that trauma-informed response and the relationship, and including the victim advocates, which I know that you've always been a big proponent of. So would you say, kind of to back up just for a bit, I don't need like an exact percentage, but on most intimate partner violence or sexual assault cases, is there usually a high rate of DNA evidence that is involved with it or not?
A lot of times there may not be a DNA connection there, especially in intimate partner violence cases. Many times there might be a delayed report as well, where that report doesn't come out until days, weeks, or months, even years after that situation. So that is something that we see that could be common.
Yeah, that is, I think, something that people have a misconception about, that there are these, slam dunk types of evidences. So as an investigator, you've had to really be creative, as I've heard you say, to find out different things. And, like, for example, putting the camera in to kind of do you called it a dual, what'd you call that when?
Yeah, counter-stalking
Counter-stalking.
surveillance techniques.
Yes,
Sure.
that sounded much better than what I was going to say. Yes. Yeah. So if you were speaking to a room of survivors right now, what would be your words of wisdom? What would be your hope? What would encourage their brave?
And I think it's something that I have heard so many times, that when survivors come to me, they're often sometimes at their last wit. They're at their last end. They don't know what to do. And I always say, keep trucking, keep pulling on, because the more you do, and unfortunately, we ask again, like I said earlier, we ask a lot for our victims, and just keep pulling, keep going, and stay strong. And a lot of times just hearing that will empower survivors to keep on moving. And that's, I think, a critical point.
It sure is. And, knowing that you're supported and believed is just fabulous. So I know you've retired recently and you're launching your business and moving into the consulting and training phase of, this exemplary career that you've had. And I think the time is really right for that, because we need the voice of strong, leaders in law enforcement, men and women, to come forward and say, we're all in this together. At least that's what I feel like is a message we need to hear. What do you think?
Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah. So we'll have a link to your email in the notes to follow the show. And I know that you're building all of your business things like website and so forth. But I know there'll be some contacts and people that would love to have you come and train. And so you do Zoom trainings and as well as in person, right?
That is correct, yes.
Yeah. Well, that's very exciting. Well, I can't tell you how much, how inspired I feel just sharing with you and learning from you. I've learned so much from you over the years, and I really appreciate your passion and your commitment to serving crime victims locally and nationally as well.
And again, thank you for having me on your show. It's been an honor.
Sure, I'd love to have you again. We'll break down some other areas of the criminal.
Definitely, just let me know.
Yeah, okay. Well, I want to say thank you to everyone for watching. You know, we gather during this time to bring light to and embrace brave and people. And it can be due to a victimization or darkness that's found in difficult moments. But, you know, we want you to know you're not alone. We want you to connect with people that have survived and overcome. And that's why we gather for Brave Embrace. So thank you very much. Until next time, be brave.